Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Attention. Is this thing on? Is it working? Good. Hear me? Sweet. All right. Nice to see you all. So I have the distinct pleasure today of introducing a colleague and an absolutely wonderful, long-standing friend, and in many ways a mentor, Professor Michael Lenz. Mike Lenz is a professor of urban planning and public policy and chair of the Luskin undergraduate program at UCLA. He's also one of the faculty directors of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. Professor Lenz's research covers pretty much every aspect of housing, from housing supply to housing affordability, rental subsidies, fair housing. His work has won numerous prizes, including Paper of the Year by Journal of American Planning Association, Housing Policy Debate, and I'm sure many other places as well. If you go in his office, he has a lot of nice trophies, not just for sports. um, but more generally, Mike is just generally known as a North Star in the field. His scholarship is some of the best out there. He's an amazing colleague, amazing mentor to many, amazing friend, and today he's going to be presenting his wonderful new book, Where the Hood At. Where the Hood At focuses on Black neighborhoods and how they've changed over time, the conditions that allow them to thrive and flourish, and the things that impede them. I think what you're going to find is over time, this book, its immediate impact is going to be known, as you'll see here today, but it's going to be one of those books that the whole field refers back to for years and quite honestly decades to come. The amount of data work that went into this, the policy know-how, and the recommendations going forward are all stuff that we're going to be chewing on for quite some time. So really excited for him to be here with us here today and for us all to learn from Professor Lenz. Thanks, man.
Okay, that's a lot to live up to. Always have your friends introduce you if you can. I certainly want to just take a moment to thank Vincent for inviting me out here. We met, probably 15 years ago at the Furman Center at NYU. It was a fast friendship that's lasted a long time and has been. Now we're colleagues, and it's really an honor and a privilege that he would invite me out here to speak to you all and have this really amazing audience. And thank you to Patrick for keeping us organized today and bringing us together. I as a part of this trip, I had an opportunity to go to NYU yesterday and present at the old alma mater, and so this East Coast swing has already been very special for me. And I want to highlight some other folks here in the Weitzman School and in the city planning department. You know, I I certainly have learned quite a lot from Elizabeth Delmel and talked to her about this project a couple points along the way, and it really cannot be understated how much Lance Freeman means to a book like this. I think I had a chance to have coffee with Lance this morning. It was great to catch up. He has a blurb on the back of the book, and one of the points at which I got to this inquiry, is just kind of a basic thing where I was looking for data on Black neighborhoods and at a kind of comprehensive level, and I never found it. And I thought, well, maybe I could, dig deeper into this and produce something that would at least be of use to me and maybe some of my students and maybe some other people that care about this topic. And then I came maybe right around that time or shortly before Lance's book, A Haven and a Hell, had come out. And, at first I got kind of a jolt because I was like, oh God, Lance already wrote this book. And, the more I read, I was like, I found some places where I was like, I would love to take this thought further. I would like take this thought further, and I'd like take this thought further. And our, time period focus is not the same. And, so his influence is all over this book, and you're lucky to have him here. But I also know that he's very happy and lucky to have you all. And I'll also add that earlier in my career, maybe somewhat ironically for an aging man, I had less hair. And so, the first few years of my career, sometimes I was confused for Lance Freeman. There's some race wrapped up in that. Obviously, we're kind of rare at academic conferences. Um, and now I have, obviously more hair, but in some places less. Um, I actually would love it if people would confuse me for Lance Freeman more, particularly, with respect to a book like this, and, dare I ever be compared to some of his works in that way. But also, he's been stealing my PhD students for about a decade. And it would be wonderful if one of them or two of them showed up at UCLA and was like, "Hey, Lance, I'm here to work with you." And I was like, "Cool, yeah, let's go." That would be fine. Okay. No more jokes for now. Well, I can't last that long. Okay. So I think, Vincent helped cover the purpose of the book, very well. My goal is to quantitatively summarize the characteristics of Black neighborhoods in this country from over about a 50-year span, from 1970 to roughly 2020. For data nerds out there, I'm using the 2015 to 19 American Community Survey. I often talk about that as 2017 data, maybe round it up to 2020 if you wish. This ends up being about 3,000 to 7,000 neighborhoods, depending on the year. And as you would know if you listen to Lance Freeman, 1970 is an inflection point in the history and the arc of Black neighborhoods for several reasons, and that's why I start there. There are, important immigration and demographic changes happening in urban America at that time. The Fair Housing Act comes out in 1968. 1970 census happens to be one of the better starting points if you want to do an historical thing like that as well. And, thinking about those time arcs, I try to discuss how these neighborhoods have evolved over time, identify where socioeconomic characteristics are better and worse, and then try to interrogate some reasons why and think about what policy may or may not be doing or able to do about that. Okay, yeah, jokes and puns are not going to be at a minimum today, so where the hook at? My hook in this book is Black music, specifically the birth and evolution of rap music. Right now, we're listening to Stevie Wonder, and this is a representative of the sounds of Motown. And so, in chapter 2, I begin by focusing on the Great Migration and the segregationist response in the urban North and eventually the West. And Detroit, home of Motown, is certainly very emblematic of this segregationist response. Detroit engaged in all of the tactics that would reinforce racial segregation and concentrate disadvantage in Black communities. But Motown also benefited from some of the spatial proximity that segregation produces. The Berry Gordy is the founder of Motown, right? And the Gordy family was much more affluent than people like Smokey Robinson, who was one of the most important songwriters and early talents in the growth of Motown. But despite this economic difference between these families, they lived in the same general neighborhood, right? That's what segregation can be, as kind of a positive enclave effect. Then Smokey Robinson literally lived down the street from Diana Ross and Aretha Franklin. So some of this enclave effect long has existed and supported Black neighborhoods. And again, referring back to Lance, his book, A Haven and a Hell, is about this exact thing, right? How Black neighborhoods can and have been havens for Black assimilation into urban society, for Black politics and economic growth, and also is a hell for some of its residents given the concentration of disadvantage in those places. So The music hook is a way in which I try to draw people to think about the interplays of Black music and culture and how that relates to the development and evolution of Black neighborhoods in the country. Chapter 3, we move to the South Bronx, which anyone who's paid attention to hip hop much over the years knows that recently it was about 50 years of a celebration that hip hop was born in the South Bronx. Obviously, no music is ever born on one day, but at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue, DJ Kool Herc had a big party, and people have looked back and said, that's the day. That's the day hip hop was born. And the South Bronx is therefore an obvious place to begin in the 1970s. And hip hop was born out of what I call an often combustible mix of concentrated poverty, Black and Latino youth culture, and immigration. It's undeniable that the Bronx was rather combustible in the early 1970s when widespread white flight and vacancy led to some mysterious homes and buildings being burned in the Bronx. The Bronx is Burning is a famous moment from the 1977 World Series when the Dodgers and Yankees played. So this is a well-known history. I argue that the South Bronx is in many ways an atypical Black neighborhood. It's always, since the early 1970s, it was heavily Latino, eventually majority Latino to this day. And while it's very poor, it's also adjacent to, one of the world's greatest economic engines, obviously being in New York City. This is also probably the first Black neighborhood to have transitioned from a Black one to a Latino one, which is happening very commonly now in California and to a lesser extent cities like Chicago. Speaking of Chicago, if there's any Chicagoans in the room, I'm going to try not to offend you. I come from a long line of Chicagoans myself. Chicago has been central to Black music before. So the Mississippi Delta is where the blues was born, but it reached commercial heights in places like Memphis and especially Chicago. But Chicago has been, in many ways, a small player in hip hop, particularly if you think about the massive size of its Black population relative to other places. It, I would say, underperforms, particularly as an industry or a music industry. I'm a big fan of Kanye West, for better or worse, in terms of his antics. I love several other artists from Chicago, but the rap industry itself is not a huge player in hip hop more broadly. And I argue that the extreme concentrated disadvantage that we see in Chicago, that we also see in a lot of other Midwest cities and metropolitan areas, has some contribution to this relatively minimal rap industry. And another way in which rap and real life, I think, intertwine in Chicago is, we know a lot about the city's gang violence from some overheated rhetoric about Chicago, but it's also real, overheated as that rhetoric might be. And the rap scene that does exist in Chicago, or at least one aspect of it, is very much intertwined with this gang violence, with some actually really tragic outcomes. So Forrest Stewart, a sociologist, wrote a book recently called The Ballad of the Bullet. And that covers the drill rap scene in Chicago and how a lot of these artists become notable by posting, videos on YouTube and other social media outlets that are very antagonistic towards other, gang affiliated folks. And this has resulted in murders and violence on several occasions. So hip hop's never too far away from the realities of the streets in Chicago. That's very apparent. West Coast. Sorry, Hetty, not Kendrick. We're gonna go quite a few years before what I assume is your time. And we're listening to Straight Outta Compton right now, and I discuss how West Coast rap and its violent lyrics and imagery further diminish the already negative perception of black neighborhoods. But you can overemphasize this, and I want to be careful about that. So I think there have been very important upsides to the stories that NWA and other West Coast artists, gangsta rap or whatever you want to call it, not just in the West Coast, but certainly centered there, they broadcast police brutality to the world. When Rodney King was beaten in 1991, people who had been paying any attention to NWA and Ice Cube, they already had an understanding of what was going on there. These are things that had been going on in the black community for decades and stories that we had been telling each other for forever. But given the additional reach of artists like NWA, people in the suburbs, white America, were at least had a little bit of a vocabulary and understanding for what they saw on those videos in 1991. So we can overemphasize the negative aspects, I think, of the violent imagery and misogyny or whatever in gangster rap, because there are very, very important messages that are being portrayed here. Also fitting for Los Angeles, I talk about the suburban aspect of hip hop and rap on the West Coast. So the home base of NWA was Compton. Snoop's home base was Long Beach. These are not in the city of Los Angeles. The suburbanization of Los Angeles is part and parcel with its music. And this is also reflected in the listenership. Gangster rap from the West Coast was very, very popular among suburban white youth in America. They wouldn't have sold so many records if it wasn't, right? Then we talk about Washington, D.C. in chapter 6. Washington, D.C., yes. Jamal, make sure I don't offend your people. So I talk about... yes, I will. And I'll get some details wrong. But I talk about there being some few obvious necessary ingredients for a rap industry or a rap presence to proliferate in a metropolitan area. You need a fair amount of black people, more people of color. You need, some poverty, some drug trade and violence to make the lyrics more colorful. Maybe some musical training happening at the schools. DC had all these things happening. It had all these things happening probably on a higher level than virtually anywhere else. But I think the most consequential rap artist is Wale, Jamal, from the DMV in DC. So Wale himself got his start as a go-go artist. What is go-go? It is a DC-specific brand of funk music that is largely a live experience. There are not a lot of commercially successful go-go artists in DC. Go-go's geographic center was the same as the center of the DC black community, essentially the Shaw U Street area, the Harlem of DC, founded by escaped black slaves in the early Civil War. Shaw U Street was 87% black and 11% white in 1970. By 2017, it was 25% black and 52% white. No black neighborhood has ever gone that kind of undergone that kind of racial transition in our country, from black to white in that scope. So my musical hook is that DC doesn't have a rap scene because it has such an amazing go-go scene, and also had a pretty good punk scene as well in the 80s. But in the Q&A, Jamal is going to correct us. Atlanta. Finally, I discuss Atlanta as the center of the 21st century rap industry, and its style has influenced everybody from finally newly minted Grammy Best Album of the Year award winner Beyonce to Gaga to Ariana Grande, everybody in between. When you turn on a pop music station, you are hearing music most of the time that's actually influenced by Atlanta brand of rap. Huge cultural import. And I argue that this is an indicator of the South's growing economic and cultural import. And to take this further, this is evidence to me that the South should be shaking off its stereotype as a cultural blackwater. And that has important implications for the extent to which people are going to think about themselves as potentially living in the South. We shouldn't, I'm a very northern biased type of person. I grew up in Minnesota and my mom told me to fear the South. And the more I learn through an inquiry like this, the more I realize that I've got a lot wrong and I got a lot to learn about the South as a potential destination. And importantly for this book, the South is the source of the fastest growing number of black neighborhoods and the most affluent ones in the country. Okay. The musical fun is just about over. The title of this book is Where the Hood At. It is a DMX song. DMX, I'll get into a little bit. I need to note that the title of this book is from a song that is deeply, deeply misogynistic and homophobic. And I don't want to have my stamp on this book as evidence that I support any of that lyrical content. It's a good pun, a good play on words, has levels to it for me in terms of geography and the extent to which these communities are at a certain level, etc. But that's important to know. What does DMX have to do with fair housing, though? Why is he relevant to this book? Earl Simmons, or DMX, was born in in Mount Vernon, New York, near Yonkers, in 1970. I came up with the title before I even knew that. That was so cool to figure out. Perfect timing, Earl. I did know that he grew up in Yonkers. I don't know if I knew that he grew up in public housing in Yonkers when I came up with the title. And Yonkers is the site of the most sustained opposition to public housing desegregation and dispersal in the country. When Earl was 10, the federal government sued various Yonkers government agencies for intentionally segregating public housing in the southwest part of Yonkers. To think about DMX's cultural import, he would release 5 albums between 1998 and 2003 that debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts. Not the rap charts, not the black people charts, not the R&B charts, the charts. He was massively popular over that time span. Fair housing in Yonkers, as I noted, is part of one of the longest running spats between local government and the federal housing and federal housing policymakers in the country, specifically on this. 1986, Mayor Nick Wasixko was elected on a wave of opposition to this desegregation. Unfortunately for Mayor Nick, the federal government or federal court mandated a desegregation plan and aggressively, by standards of these sorts of things, enforced that this plan be carried out. So Wasixko reluctantly led on this desegregation plan. He was then defeated by a backlash election, died by suicide at the age of 34 after he left office. And this whole story is the topic of Lisa Belkin's book, Show Me a Hero. And there was a HBO miniseries in which Oscar Isaac played the mayor by the same name. In 2021, thinking about the interplay between DMX and things happening in his hometown, a federal monitor ruled in favor of Westchester County's fair housing approach, which likely signals the effort or the end of that the federal government's attempt for 4 decades to push the county towards a less segregated public housing landscape. And that April, Earl Simmons dies of a cocaine-induced heart attack at the age of 50. So, thinking about DMX's Yonkers neighborhood, is very poor. It was more racially diverse than many black neighborhoods, and it was also suburban by most of our definitions of what's central city and suburban. So we could think that this is not a typical black neighborhood, but I want to understand through this inquiry, what is a typical black neighborhood? We know that there's a persistence of gaps between black individuals and families and other groups. We think that this is likely related to spatial disparities. We think that neighborhoods matter in terms of influencing your outcomes throughout your life. And we have lots of studies that focus on these disparities between individuals, but I argue that the forces that led to concentrated disadvantage in black neighborhoods are not the exact same that create disparities at the individual level. And the things that maintain these disparities at the geographic or neighborhood level are not the same that make these disparities persist at the individual level. We devalue black neighborhoods in real estate markets and in other ways that are absolutely related to the ways that we might devalue black life or education or outcomes, but they're not the exact same, is the argument that I make in this book. And so looking at the neighborhood level is, I think, really important when we think about a full picture of the black experience in this country and of the full picture of racial disparities. I also, talked about how I went searching for a bunch of data on black neighborhoods and I never found it. And so I decided that nobody's ever done this before. And, academics have to prove that sometimes. But don't ever do a study like this just because it's the first one. Sometimes there's a reason why nobody studied it. Okay. Keep the puns coming, Dad. Where the data at? First, what is a black neighborhood? How do I define that? I take U.S. Census data from roughly 172 metropolitan areas at the decennial census dates in 1970, 80, 90, 2000, and then the 2010 census, and then the 2015-19 American Community Survey. I start with census tracts as a proxy for neighborhoods, always a, limited choice there, but the best I thought I could do. And I define a black neighborhood as one where blacks occupy the largest racial or ethnic group out of our flawed framework of roughly 4 racial or ethnic groups: blacks, Hispanics or Latinos, whites, and Asians and Pacific Islanders. So by defining it this way, blacks are a plurality. They are the largest racial or ethnic group. I don't set the threshold at majority, which maybe some people think I should. The good bad news, bad because this is how race operates in America, is that when blacks are a plurality, they're almost always a majority, right? Black neighborhoods are usually very black, right? They're not usually 30% or 40% black, and there's a mix of other people around. That's not typical. But good news, this is changing. In 1970, 98% of plurality tracts were majority tracts. In 2017, that was down to 80%. So, as I'll show with some more specific data, black neighborhoods are racially diversifying, just like all neighborhoods are racially diversifying. Some things that I find regional concentration and variation. There's a particular socioeconomic strength in black neighborhoods in the South and West, but unfortunately in the West, black neighborhoods are disappearing. I find limited convergence with non-black neighborhoods. Black neighborhoods, like black neighborhood socioeconomic conditions, are getting a little bit better vis-a-vis non-black neighborhoods. Black neighborhoods are more socioeconomically homogeneous than non-black neighborhoods. Basically, when you select on something like neighborhood race, you're kind of shrinking the diversity of a place. Black neighborhoods are plenty diverse in a bunch of different ways, but they're less diverse than non-black ones. The success stories in black neighborhoods are now more successful than they used to be. Back in 1970 or 1980, the most successful neighborhoods were pretty much lower class neighborhoods, right? Places where incomes were below the average. Now, the most affluent black neighborhoods are middle class neighborhoods. They're places where places of average or slightly above average incomes. And then I think it's important to note that it's pretty hard to have a successful black neighborhood without a strong regional economy. And so I'll talk about how I think I know that in a minute. Some arguments to kind of push us towards, some solutions in this area. One is that black people routinely report that they want to live in integrated neighborhoods, but relatively black ones. That's similar for other racial groups, but it's important to think about these racial preferences. Flourishing black neighborhoods are concentrated in the South and major metropolitan areas. Housing costs are rising, especially in these major metropolitan areas, but gentrification is rarely the problem, but sometimes it is. I argue that neighborhood-based investments are not particularly effective, or we don't have a great evidence base on these investments. And so I argue that we also need a regional or a metropolitan level focus on these types of investments. I'm hopeful for the potential of things that I call and others call inclusive development, where we are investing in neighborhoods while also adding the potential for people to occupy this space at below market rates. And finally, even though this is a study of neighborhoods, I think it's relatively impossible to fully address these neighborhood disparities without addressing individual level disparities. Okay, on to the data for real. First, just putting some numbers on what I mean by regional concentration. So, black neighborhoods are highly concentrated in particular parts of the country. In New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, DC, and Detroit, were responsible for about 45% of black neighborhoods in 1970 when I began this study, and that's now down to about 36%. That's basically due to the rapid decrease of black neighborhoods in Los Angeles from about 268 to 77, and the sharp increase in black neighborhoods in Atlanta. So Los Angeles makes up a much lower share than it used to. The largest numbers of black neighborhoods are found in these large population centers that I list here, but the largest concentration of Black neighborhoods are in the South, right? The South has the metros with the places with the largest share of Black neighborhoods. Okay, limited convergence. In 1970 and 80, the average Black neighborhood was about 3 times as impoverished as the average non-Black neighborhood. By 2010 and now, the ratio is about 2 to 1. So that's the big successful happy headline. We've, made it from 3 to 1 to 2 to 1. We've still got another 1 to go, but parity is closer. This is what this looks like in table 3.3. This comes from both in decrease in the overall average poverty rate in Black neighborhoods and an increase in the average poverty rate in non-Black neighborhoods. So from basically 27 to 23% in Black neighborhoods, from 9 to 12% in non-Black neighborhoods. The non-Black neighborhood story is probably largely a product of immigration and the diversification of this country, right? So during this 50-year time period, there's a huge increase in the number of people from Asia and Latin America, the Caribbean, to a lesser extent Africa, and some of the rising poverty rates in non-Black neighborhoods is due to this diversification. But a lot of this racial diversification is happening in Black neighborhoods too, right? And so it's not just, immigrants being more likely to be in non-Black neighborhoods that's happening here. Racial diversity has changed considerably in Black neighborhoods as well, as I just alluded to. So something that I find very interesting about this particular figure, and I'll try to reinforce it in the next one, is that the percentage of whites in living in Black neighborhoods from 1970 to 2017 is almost entirely consistent, right? There's a short drop in 1980 and 1990 as white flight is, still more of a thing, and then a slight increase in recent decades. But essentially, the share of whites living in Black neighborhoods is basically the same over this time period. Why is this interesting to me? Well, this country got a whole lot less whiter, particularly in its metropolitan areas during this time, right? 94% of the population living in non-Black neighborhoods in 1970 is white. Some of that's because we didn't ask, are you Hispanic or Latino in 1970, but we did in 1980. So, okay, fine, let's start in 1980. 85% of the non-Black neighborhood metro US was white. Only 62% in 2017. Again, why is this interesting to me? I can't tell you the motivations of white people based on that top line, right? But this tells me that whites are probably considerably more comfortable living in Black neighborhoods than they used to be, right? Because their share of the total population has fallen off a cliff, and yet their share in Black neighborhoods is staying the same. And this, I think, illustrates that a little bit more clearly. This is simply the ratio of racial composition between 1980s non-Black neighborhoods and their in 1980s non-Black neighborhoods going through 2017, right? And non-Black to Black neighborhoods, and we're only at 3.5 to 1 ratio, where we were at 8.5 to 1. Whites are far more likely to live in Black neighborhoods than they used to be. If you pluck a white individual out of the country, are they likely to live in a Black neighborhood? No, but they're much more likely to live there than they used to be. Took me about a half hour to start talking about housing, Vincent. I'm sorry. One of my hobby horses, other than race, is housing and housing production. And One really interesting thing for a housing person like me is to look at the extent to which Black and non-Black neighborhoods have been building housing over this time period. And the punchline is that we're not building much housing anywhere over the last 2 or 3 decades. How do I know that? In the gray dash line up top, that's the percent of housing units built more than 30 years ago. So this is how much old housing do you have? And this is how much new housing do you have? And red is black, non-black, and gray is black. Right? So we know that none of these places are particularly new in terms of their housing stock, but I can, torture these numbers a little bit and stare at this figure long enough and conclude for you. You can conclude whatever you want, but I can conclude for you that the age of the Black neighborhood housing stock is starting to look more similar to the non-Black neighborhood housing stock, which is super important because one of the reasons why Black neighborhoods have been so disadvantaged over the last 100 years is because we first put a lot of Black people only in the old places where the housing stock was decrepit and distressed, and then people didn't have the money to reinvest, or they chose not to reinvest in those places, right? And so if Black neighborhood housing is starting to be on a more equal playing field than non-Black neighborhood housing, and just in terms of age, I think we're likely to see more investment opportunity, some other things that might happen from that you might be worried about, gentrification, displacement, et cetera. Okay, fine. But this is, to me, really, really important. Because we're not building much housing anywhere, rents are rising everywhere. That's what this shows. Philly is traditionally a place where people don't complain about the housing cost that much, right? But I'm sure y'all have tried to afford housing near Penn and been kind of sad once or twice. Yeah? Okay. Home values, similar story, but Black neighborhoods, we already knew this from, Elora Raymond, Dan Immergluck, some other people that looked at the Great Recession. Black neighborhoods or housing in Black neighborhoods rebounded actually quite slowly from the Great Recession. We talked a lot about during the Great Recession that the foreclosure crisis is much more acute in Latino and Black neighborhoods. And, the even worse news is that this rebound happened very swiftly in non-Black neighborhoods and quite slowly in Black ones. I think / hope that if I updated this, we're on this trajectory right here, but I can't tell you that for sure. Vincent will look that up. Okay. Now thinking about the variation within Black neighborhoods, where are they thriving and struggling? Black neighborhoods on a very simple regional scale, 4 regions, Midwest, Northeast, Southwest, are least disadvantaged in the West, and that's driven largely by California, where the Black neighborhoods are, but they're disappearing. You see that the West is responsible now for only about 3% of the nation's Black neighborhoods. We have significant growth in the South, which is great news because a lot of these growing numbers of Black neighborhoods are actually fairly affluent places. Not all of them, of course, but a lot of them are. And then a slow amount of growth in the Midwest, slow decline in the Northeast. This is where Black neighborhood conditions are the least advantageous. Picking on the Northeast here, I would exclude Philly and New York City and Boston from that description. The disadvantaged Black neighborhoods in the Northeast are really like upstate New York. That's what we're talking about there. I already got to this just a minute ago. The point in this slide is that we're not just talking about absolute disadvantage in the Midwest and in some of the Northeast places. We're talking about relative disadvantage. You could tell a story that, hey, I guess we call it the Rust Belt for a reason. It's, pick on whatever town you want to in the Midwest. People are struggling everywhere. That's why black neighborhoods are disadvantaged. Yes, but also in plenty of these places, this is where the greatest inequality is between black and non-black neighborhoods. And that's what I mean by relative disadvantage. Take Peoria. Peoria, I only knew before this as the place where Richard Pryor grew up in a brothel. And, if you're considerably younger than me, you're like, who's Richard Pryor? I mean, I was going to say Chris Rock, but Kevin, what's the short guy? Kevin Hart. He's kind of better than all those guys, but your mileage may vary. Richard Pryor, amazing black comedian, grew up in a brothel in Peoria, Illinois. That tells you enough of what you need to know, perhaps, about race in Peoria, Illinois, at least in the 40s and 50s when Richard Pryor was growing up. But I looked at the data. This is one of those things that jumped off the data output. And I was like, damn, look at Peoria. 10 black census tracts in 2017. The unemployment rate in those tracts ranged from 12 to 31%, 31%. Ooh, that's big. If you want to compare to somewhere like Nashville, the average black census tract had an unemployment rate of 6%. So the average in Nashville was half as high as the most employed black Peoria census tract. Okay, that's crazy enough. Peoria's non-black census tract poverty rate is only 10%. That's below the nation's average by 4 or 5 percentage points, depending on the year. It's 41% in black neighborhoods. I'm plucking the most extreme case here, I'll be honest. This is the biggest disparity that I found, I'm pretty sure. But the Midwest has a lot of this. I'm from St. Paul. The Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area has a great standard of living, a strong economy. Housing's cheap because it's cold. And it is one of the 3 or 4 places with the greatest ratio, the greatest poverty rate or average income ratio between black and non-black neighborhoods. So even in a place where you think like, this is a pretty equal society, doing pretty well, segregation's not that extreme, like I know Twin Cities pretty well, like that kind of disparity just exists in the Midwest. And so it's different. So thinking about some of the more success stories, I focus quite a lot on Washington, D.C. at number 1 in terms of the lowest poverty rate. Then you got basically where Fort Hood is. There's a lot of black people in the Army. Public employment in the Army is actually a pretty decent way to be in the middle class. Los Angeles, Hartford, Charlotte, and then I get to Atlanta, right? So DC and Atlanta are 2 obvious places where black neighborhood conditions are really strong, and these black neighborhoods are also very numerous. You're also seeing a growing affluence throughout the South, places like Charlotte, Raleigh-Durham, Houston, Columbia, South Carolina, Virginia Beach. Some of the from relatively small or medium-sized metros to really large ones like Houston and Dallas, they continually pop up on kind of like the best socioeconomic indicators that I can find. But again, even in the places with the lowest poverty rates, you're hitting roughly the nation's average, right? And that's what DC is. So turning our attention a little bit more to Atlanta and DC. You see that some of Atlanta's success is more recent than DC's, and DC's black neighborhood poverty rate, jumps up a little bit in 2010 and then goes back down. So this is not just a perfect linear drop by any means, but these are the clear success stories in terms of number and affluence. In DC, you have to put your attention particularly on home prices, right? So in 2010 and 2017, in black neighborhoods, the average home price was hovering around $300,000. In some parts of DC, of course, we've already had racial transition out of a black status, particularly thinking about the Shaw U Street corridor, where home prices have literally risen about $500,000 in the last few decades. And that's constant dollars. So this challenge of, encouraging and being hopeful about increased affluence in these neighborhoods and the cost of living there is absolutely real. Okay, some little bits about what factors drive neighborhood poverty. I tried to, run the best regression models I could on this. I'm, not the world's greatest econometrician, but I've learned a thing or two, and I tried to apply it here. So, average family income is in a metropolitan area is super important. So we have kind of these various geographic levels that I think are somewhat explanatory, right? We have these big regions of the country where there's variation. We have metropolitan areas, cities, and then neighborhoods. At the metropolitan area level, it's just the case that you need a strong regional economy, strong income, and factors like income inequality and segregation, of course, matter. The southern part of the country, as I noted, is much more beneficial to black neighborhoods than it used to be. So in my models, the coefficient on South used to be negative, right? Controlling for a bunch of other stuff. If you're in the South and you're in a black neighborhood, your poverty rate is higher. Now that's opposite, right? If you're in the South and controlling for all these other things, a black neighborhood is more affluent. Segregation matters, but not as much as you might think once you add in other socioeconomic characteristics of black neighborhoods. Most of the variation is explained at the metropolitan level, what I call, or others call, income generating processes. The income level, the basic GDP type stuff in a metropolitan area, and then what we call neighborhood sorting processes, which is like income, or how income inequality is sorted across space, and how people are sorted across space. But then if you add neighborhood characteristics like the education level in the neighborhood, share of female-headed households, things like that we usually associate with higher poverty levels, they of course matter and explain about 30%. Okay. One bit before I speed ahead to the finish line on kind of thinking through these questions of improvement or affluence in black neighborhoods. Are we talking about gentrification? Are we talking about a growing black middle class? Why not both? But actually not much of either is the norm in black neighborhoods. So I always start a conversation in gentrification with my students with thinking about whether there's rising demand for a particular type of neighborhood that you're worried about gentrifying. And so if we think about black neighborhoods, the first question to me is like, do we think is there rising demand for living in black neighborhoods? And there is some evidence that there are some fundamental pushers of demand or drivers of demand. There are higher income neighborhoods that are increasingly settling in central city neighborhoods that are, often black. They're adjacent to black neighborhoods. The higher income households are sometimes maybe not moving in, but they're just not leaving central cities until they have kids much, much later in their lives. Like there are some demographic things going on. And then I talked a lot about this housing age gap, right? And I think that is already having an influence on the extent to which people start to value black neighborhoods more. And I think we're going to continue to see it as if the suburban YIMBYs just or NIMBYs, sorry, the suburban NIMBYs win every battle, and they keep all the housing out of the white places and the non-black places. Like, that housing's just going to get old, and people are going to say, I don't want to live over there anymore, and I can't live over there anymore, right? Um, but it's always important, I think, to emphasize that the overwhelmingly typical condition in black neighborhoods is not enough investment, not enough people want to live there, not too much of these sorts of things. And population growth is still heaviest in our suburban areas that we don't think are associated with, black neighborhood transition. The numbers on this. Okay, so just to take this slides a little bit slowly. So, at a very basic level, I think if we're trying to determine between a growing black middle class, which I think we all think would be super great in pretty much every black neighborhood, versus gentrification, which we'd be a little bit more worried about, we at least want to determine we would think that a growing black middle class would be reflective of income growth in these places, and housing cost growth would be more of a gentrification story. It ain't totally that simple, and in the book I think I make it more complicated than that. But these numbers are kind of throwing us in that direction. 10% of black neighborhoods were in the top quartile of their metropolitan area's home values in 1980. So 2.5 times as much as in 2017, 2.5 times as much as in 1980. So that tells me that's pretty fast growth in home values in these neighborhoods. That says, ooh, maybe there's some gentrification going on here, and that's a housing market story. 4% of black neighborhoods are in the top income quartile in their metropolitan area income distribution, barely changed from 3% in 1980. So that's not telling me that there's a ton of like higher income people moving into this neighborhood, or that black people in these neighborhoods are becoming more higher income. So I think that we have, in this comparison, a little bit more of a gentrification story. But again, it's not the most common thing going on in these neighborhoods. I do find mild evidence that black neighborhoods are more likely to racially transition in the past. When I just look purely at the pace of racial transition. I also find that gentrification rates are slowly rising, but rising nonetheless. I don't just look at like housing cost growth there. I'm also looking at education characteristics, income, and race. And there is a correlation between racial transition from black neighborhood to something else and what we would think of as gentrification, these increasing incomes and education rates. So they are intertwined, these transitions. This just shows the comparison between black neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, and high poverty neighborhoods. And you see that in recent years, say take 2010 and 2017, black, Hispanic, and high poverty neighborhoods are gentrifying at pretty similar rates. And they're hitting about 8 to 10, 12% of the active neighborhoods in that sample in that year. Like everything else, this is a regional story. Gentrification rates in Western black neighborhoods are about 17% and are higher there. The Bay Area, 25%. Some places gentrification is a really big problem in black neighborhoods. Some places it's not. So, some quick ideas on policy. 4 key findings: slow improvement or limited convergence. Metropolitan and regional differences are really important. Metro level characteristics are super important. So strong regional economies are vital. Gentrification concerns, I say, are overheated in most places. Some places like DC, San Francisco, Los Angeles, you could throw a few others on this list. Super big time. What's been tried before? Moving people out of disadvantaged neighborhoods has had limited but important effects. Efforts to invest in neighborhoods through housing policy have been piecemeal and rarely sustained. The evidence base is small. Economic development usually entails tax breaks, some mild success there. Community development evidence is very limited. We do have, some reason to believe, thinking about Patrick Sharkey's most recent book, that a lot of community organizing, particularly in high crime neighborhoods, has helped to make those places more safe. So there is, a growing evidence base on community development, but it's really, really small. I put what we should do on about 3 pillars. One is a regional focus, focusing on regions as much as we focus on neighborhoods in terms of these interventions. Inclusive development, let's call this, things like inclusionary housing or zoning, which is not really my favorite thing, or community land trusts, which I think have a little bit more potential, and then investing in people. So that would be anything from reparations to universal basic income and broadening the safety net. This is, my list of things that we could consider for regional regional focus. One thing I talk a fair amount in the book is, since Black people like living in relatively Black neighborhoods, we could find ways to accommodate moves to the South where there are more affluent Black neighborhoods. Obviously, people don't move regions all the time, so I know that that's of limited reach, but it's something to think about. Also, on the regional side, we need to invest in the Midwestern metros that are more likely to be struggling economically. A lot of things we can do to increase population in those places through immigration. Yeah, I know. But also investing in college campuses and universities and state university systems, community land trusts, etc. Invest in people, etc. I'll leave the thought experiment up here real quick. And it has to do with the rapid change in the Shawn U Street neighborhood in DC. So you're looking at a place that in 1970 was 87% Black. The poverty rate, though, has been halved from 27 to 14%. The median home value has risen from $110,000 to $630,000. What do we think about racial progress in these places? And what do we think about, and what should we think about racial progress in these places? Like, we don't want this place to have been frozen in disadvantage in 1970, but we also see a very, very rapid change that can be disruptive to this community and others. Okay. We'll skip the stakes is high music because we got to talk, and then we'll go there. Cool. Thank you. Oh, yeah, that's the link to the book. Akira already told me I failed by not having books here, and I agree. Live and learn. Now you know. Live and learn. First trip. Akira.
Hi. Thank you for this lovely presentation. Probably one of the more informative talks I've been to in my life.
Thank you.
I do wonder if you could spend some time talking about the role of mass incarceration. Also has a nice birth date in the 1970s. And you talk about the West Coast and the disappearance of Black neighborhoods, and just like thinking about like prison data.
Yeah.
I also wonder if this data and maps are available on a website. Like, have you written a grant for that to do that? That would be a fun project.
Yeah.
One of your Lance speeches.
Yes. Right. So I'm thinking about college football, like the transfer window. Bianca we could get a transfer going. I'm sorry, Bianca. Um, such great questions. So I'll do the second one first. That is a reminder that I worked at different points in time with some great RAs and colleagues to build a website of maps, with all of these data behind it, the poverty rates and black share and all those sorts of things. So I need to maybe get a little money to like get that thing over the finish line and make sure that this link, also gets people to the kind of do your own analysis sort of stuff, which would be really cool. So make sure to do that. Mass incarceration, that's an amazing question. So, we know there's a project at UCLA, the Bunch Center for African American Studies, called $1 Million Hoods, and I'm not sure if they came up with this concept before anybody else. I think this might have been existing already, in which we know that there are several neighborhoods, scores of neighborhoods. I'm not sure exactly the number, where the U.S. or state carceral systems have spent over $1 million or spend over $1 million annually locking people from that neighborhood up, right? There's no question that basically all of them are probably in my like 1970, 1980, 1990 sample of black neighborhoods, right? Like that's the same damn geography that we're talking about. So, one could throw an asterisk on like the limited convergence story and say, hey, like a lot of the poorest people that were in that neighborhood in 1970 are incarcerated, and that's why they're not in the data. Like that's real. I don't know. Of course, we don't know like exactly what that number is, but it's a number. And then of course, like what are the downstream effects of that? Like, your dad is incarcerated and you live in this neighborhood and your outcomes are now worse because of that. So that this is just me riffing and musing, man. I think that's super interesting, and it's, I the last thing I'll say is like, I wanted to bring like crime data and school quality data and all these like neighborhood sort of measurement things, and I'll just like, hey baby, let's play with the census and cook on that, but yeah, so that's just another thing that would be amazing to have as a part of it. Yeah. More PhD projects, exactly. John?
Yeah, great presentation. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the first part where you went into these typologies of different music, but also different neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
Not assuming one was caused a little more descriptive. It's very interesting. But
Thank you.
Turn to policy.
Yeah.
So maybe at the time you went into the Permit Center, I don't know when that was, but in the mid-1990s to about 2006, there was a tremendous amount of optimism in this country.
Yeah.
Black home ownership rates were the highest they'd ever been. They
Yeah.
were rising. Segregation rates black-white segregation rates were falling at the fastest rate possible. And this was because of alignment between Republicans and Democrats, between the president and Congress, to basically shovel a lot of mortgage capital to blacks in urban neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And it succeeded. It really boosted black home ownership rates. It boosted black wealth tremendously.
Yep.
I don't know if you picked that up in your something like you referenced it. And then the Great Depression came, and
Yep.
President Obama did nothing to secure space of 3 years, basically, things have regressed to where they were worse than 1990. I mean, this the facts. So that I'm not. So, first question.
Yeah.
If Obama had done something, Obama and Congress had done something, and they didn't have a good window to do it, to try and secure that black homeownership investment.
Yeah.
Do you think things would be better today?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, it's not going to happen because I read in the newspaper this morning where Trump and Musk want to get rid of Section 8 completely.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yes.
Really frightening.
This is true.
Way to get rid
Yeah.
of it. If somehow I could wave a magic wand and return to an era where we used housing policy and mortgage capital, mortgage policy to invest in black families, black households, and black neighborhoods, do you think that'll make a difference today?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. You know, Vincent introduced me as someone who studies every aspect of housing policy, and that's just absolutely not true because I don't do much with home ownership. I'm a student of home ownership and mortgage stuff. But I talked about and looked at the home value data as best as I can, and I think that slow rebound in black neighborhoods from the Great Recession is absolutely points to the answer to your first question being yes, right? Like if we had done more of the like neighborhood stabilization, foreclosure, helping individual underwater borrowers, if we had done more of that, that would have had the biggest bang for the buck in these distressed neighborhoods and neighborhoods where black homeowners were struggling the most. So I think there's no question that the answer to your question is yes. What was the second question again?
Do you think it's worth a try now?
Yes. Yeah. Well. Yeah. So, I think again, I'm not a mortgage or homeownership policy expert, but I think there's tons of space and room for helping people buy their first home or supporting lower income borrowers in general. In Southern California, I can spend all of my time talking about like homelessness and renter policy, and I largely do, but like quite regularly, a policymaker or a practitioner will be like, what do we do about the fact that it costs $800,000 for a starter home, and of course, again, I'm like, I don't know, but like, if we only focus on renters, there's this huge population of people that are not getting any kind of support. And of course, I don't think we support renters nearly enough, but I also don't think we support potential homeowners enough either.
I have to call it for time. You want to do one last question?
I would love to. Yes, sir.
What's the thought that right here now, you may be running for our lives, being out,
Running for our lives from government decisions or people, or just specifically as the life of an unhoused member? Just take what? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, black people in this country have always been either on the run from something or chasing the promise of the American dream. And it's always been held away from us by various forces. Today's Rosa Parks' birthday. She ran really fast while seated, right, towards that dream. I think the last maybe 8 to 10 years have taught us that we don't reach that dream unless we keep running towards it. And no, sometimes other people aren't running towards that dream for us. And that people can start pulling us back more. The long arc of history does not bend towards justice unless we run towards that justice, I think, is what I'm learning. And then last thing I'll say is if you add the layer of homelessness onto this, which is which is at a very high crisis level where I live every day in Los Angeles, and it impacts the Black community by far more than any other, is that we have to I am optimistic and heartened by the sustained financial effort that the people of Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles, are making to try to help the problem. Not everybody's on board with that, and nor will they ever be. There's a lot of people that say a lot of out-of-pocket shit about people that live on the streets. But I am optimistic and inspired by the fact that most of our voting public says we have to treat these people humanely and we have to try to find a solution. So I'm not like 100% pessimistic about anything going on in this country right now, and specifically about that. But I understand it's pretty hard right now to find all of the hope all the time.
Give you a big thank you here.
Okay.
We're at time.
But we can keep talking.
So, in the early 1900s, the Azusa struck California and homeless population gave everybody paid. So the whole movement of civilized life, that is so very, very
I'll have to learn that history. Thank you.
Well, and on that note, a tremendous thank you.
You have the
Professor
book?
Lens. I have the book.
Ha!
See?
I didn't bring one.
Everyone get a copy.